Welcome back to the Physics of Faith podcast. I'm Tim.
I'm Tommy.
And we are still in 1 Peter, and we're getting ready to read 1 Peter chapter 3. We do recommend, if you haven't already, go back, listen to 1 Peter 1, 1 Peter 2. Also, don't forget, we've got a collection of these now. So this is 1 Peter, but we also have done Galatians, we've done James, and we've done Philippians.
Yep.
And we've really been enjoying kind of the difference. We started with James, we went through the letters of Paul, and now we're with Peter. We're kind of enjoying the difference of tone and how Peter speaks.
Yeah.
Enjoying maybe is the wrong word. And it's not that I'm not enjoying it, but we're appreciating the differences.
Yeah. It is different, and something I think I said in the first chapter. It's interesting when you read this to remember that Peter was there with Jesus, and that doesn't discount what Paul's writing by any means. I believe, just like any book of the Bible, any word of the Bible was written by God ultimately, and inerrant and used for teaching as it says. But when you read it like that, it just comes across a little bit different, and it's important. Yeah. It's important to remember that because we sometimes get hung up in this is all just one book written by the same person, and it's a whole collection written over several thousand years by several different people.
Right, absolutely. Okay, so let's start here. We're going to start in 1 Peter 3, verse 1, and we're going to read through verse 6 to start. And again, we're going to read a section, we're going to break it down, and then we'll move on to the next section. So I am reading in the New American Standard. In the same way, you, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won over without a word by the behavior of their wives, as they observe your pure and respectful behavior. Your adornment must not be merely the external, braiding the hair, wearing gold jewelry, or putting on apparel, but it should be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. For in this way the holy women of former times, who hoped in God, also used to adorn themselves, being subject to their own husbands, just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you have proved to be her children if you do what is right without being frightened by any fear. All right, so
I think that's obvious. Wives, do what your husbands say. All right, next verse.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Black and white, right?
Yes.
No.
Wow. It's so easy to just do that there. I know any ladies that are listening or have just suddenly leaned a little bit closer, trying to say, okay, what are they going to say about this? And I know there's some men that are probably leaning a little bit closer too.
Oh, sweet.
What are you going to say about this? Yeah. So again, this is another chapter that starts with in the same way, which is referring to the previous chapter, right?
Yeah, kind of in the middle of the thought. Yeah.
And the thing that we ended the previous chapter with was being subject to earthly authority while honoring God through it.
Right.
And so this is kind of an interesting context. If you think about it in that context, we're talking a little bit about something a little bit different, though not limited to marriage as we understand it today.
Yeah.
Right? We're talking about some things a little bit different. So the word for subject here is the Greek hupotasso, and it means a voluntary attitude of giving in, cooperating, assuming responsibility, or carrying a burden. So I think there's something to be said about this when we talk about wives being subject to their husbands. This is not a point of weakness. This is a point of strength.
Yeah.
Of them carrying some of the burdens that their husbands may be carrying. And as I mentioned, Peter's likening this back to his discussion about how being submissive to an unjust government was a witness to those in that government. Contextually, what Paul is addressing here is women who convert while their husband has yet to convert.
Exactly.
And suggesting they not use their faith as a reason to leave him or assume superiority over him.
Absolutely.
But instead use their submission of honoring him to win him over to Christ. And I think it's important to note here as well, he specifically says, be subject to your own husbands,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
this is not to say that women are subject to men,
Yes, exactly.
but it is to say that in the marriage context, women minister to men through subjectivity.
Yeah.
So if that makes sense, it's not to say that they are less equal. When we talk about, like, he points out, he calls out Sarah here and talks about following Sarah's example. Sarah was by no means a lesser person than Abraham,
Right.
you know, and she carried that burden that and walked with Abraham in the promise that was given to Abraham. She was as equal a part of that as he was. And so that's always important to remember.
Yeah.
Now, there's also a little bit here about some things about, don't merely adorn yourself on the external. Talks about braiding hair and wearing jewelry and that kind of thing. But to make sure that the thing that you really work on is your heart. I think it's important to note here that contextually, again, when he's saying this, he's not saying that you can't braid your hair or wear jewelry.
Absolutely.
He's saying that it shouldn't be the only thing about you, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So again, these verses should not be used to be taken to tell women not to be women, but to be servants instead. That's not what Peter is saying here.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, this is saying that you mentioned exactly for women, especially wives who became followers of Christ after they were married, whose husbands didn't. That's really who he's really focusing on here, and he's saying that, and Paul talks about this. He kind of says, whatever you are when you become a follower of Christ, stay that.
Yes.
So if you have a job, as long as it's not as long as you're
not
don't be a prostitute. If you're a prostitute when you become a follower of Christ, don't continue to be a prostitute.
if you manufacture idols for a living,
yeah, exactly.
You should stop
that off. Yeah, but no, if you are married, as a wife, your position as the wife is to continue to love and honor your husband and to be a good wife, and in whatever that means. And there's several different ways that means. But this doesn't exactly, you hear the word submissive and it thinks like, okay, do whatever he says and yada, yada, yada. But the Bible also doesn't give men the right to lord that over and to be kings and say, you do whatever I say, wife.
Well, I think that's the part that gets missed a lot of times when we have these conversations about verses like this, is we forget to go to verse 7.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and read verse 7 and continue that conversation. Verse 7 says, you husbands in the same way live with your wives in an understanding way, as with someone weaker, since she is a woman, and show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers will not be hindered. So I said, let's continue this because it's going to also show, but then I know somebody listening probably right now is like, oh, so you wanted to tell us that we're weak too? But let's dive into this a little bit. So as we were kind of discussing here, when Peter's talking about this, he's talking about a different relationship dynamic than what we're accustomed to.
Yeah.
And in those times, in Rome at those times, and in these countries where they're at, among the Gentiles, and women had no marital rights.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's to say, if a husband came home and found his wife in an affair, he was legally authorized to kill her on the spot.
Mm-hmm.
If a woman found her husband in an affair, she was not legally authorized to execute him.
Right.
Right? She oftentimes was seen more as a property or a belonging in some ways other than a partner.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's important because what Peter is trying to get them to is that under Christ, marriage is about partnership.
Yes.
Not about hierarchy.
Yeah.
Right? So he says, he tells the husbands that the same way he's instructed the wives to be what the husbands need, he's instructing the husbands to be what the wives need. And so again, live with your wife in an understanding way. That is really just that concept of living with your wife. Again, like in that context, the wife was there, and while the husband lived his life, and he's saying, live that life with your wife.
Yeah, there's a couple different places in the Bible that kind of goes through this that says wives submit to your husbands, yada yada yada, and then says husbands, yada yada yada, and no offense to Peter, no offense to this book. This probably isn't the best version of this kind of statement or this teaching,
Right?
Because Paul goes into a much more detailed about the husband's position because Paul says, wives, submit to your husbands. But he also says, husbands, love your wives the way Christ loved the church.
Right.
Well, what did Christ do for the church? He died.
Yes.
So I would imagine, wives, you want to trade? because the husbands have a much loftier duty to their wives than wives to their husbands, when you put it that way.
You could say that. I think in the end, it all kind of becomes equal.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
but
and
that's
so
the point of this is, and you're right. Like Paul fleshes it out more. Peter is in agreement with Paul.
Yeah. Like I said, there's a couple different versions of this and a couple of Paul's different letters, and this isn't the. Paul goes into a little more detail, but the purpose of this, what he's saying there is for women, your beauty does not come from your outside. It comes in the way that you live.
Yeah.
It comes in the way that you treat your husband, regardless of how he treats you, regardless of the way that what he does for you, the way he treats you, the way you are to love your husband and to, be. I'm trying to say this without saying the wrong thing and it not meaning saying something that I don't. Sounds like what I don't mean, it's very similar to in the same way when Peter talks about being in submission to governing authorities.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that you do everything that they say. If they tell you to do something that is against God, you are not to do that.
Right. Exactly.
So if your husband told you to bow down to an idol, there you have an out.
Right.
But if your husband says, whatever, we're moving here or whatever that is, go with him because he is your husband and that is how you minister to him. And that is, Peter says in here, that you would be won over with your actions, not just your words.
Right. And we've read a number of verses in the past about how we should consider others over ourselves.
Yeah.
And that's ultimately what he's saying here is he's telling the wives to consider your husband over yourself more than you would consider anyone else over yourself and think about what he wants and put that ahead of your needs. But again, he comes back and he tells the husbands to do something that's completely radical for that time and area.
Yeah.
Which is to love and live with your wife, to respect your wife, and to show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life. So when we hear that concept of being a fellow heir, that is a term of equality.
Yeah.
That in Christ we are equal and we are receiving the same reward. We are not necessarily, because we are the husband or the man, we are not necessarily elevated in the kingdom of heaven because of that.
Well, yeah, and look how verse 7 ends. He says, with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with of the gracious gift of life. And obviously, I'm reading the NIV, different than you. But it says, so that nothing will hinder your prayers.
Yeah.
Like that's really saying something. Like the way you treat your wife makes a difference in how God hears your prayers.
Yeah.
Yeah,
the effectiveness of that prayer. It's important. You need to love, respect, and honor and cherish your wife.
Yeah.
That's what Peter is saying. And here's the thing, and I think wives understand this. I think women understand this, is that when your husband does that, there's no problem being more submissive or more subject to your husband. because when he makes a decision, he makes it with your best interests.
Yeah.
And it's not even a leap of faith, because you're probably having a conversation about it, because he's also trying to place you as more important than himself.
Exactly.
And so it is a partnership. And unfortunately, sometimes when we read these things at face value, it's very easy to read a word and get so angry that we miss the rest of that context.
Yeah.
All right, so let's go 8 through 12. To sum up, all of you be harmonious, sympathetic, loving, compassionate, and humble, not returning evil for evil or insult for insult, but giving a blessing instead. For you were called for the very purpose that you would inherit a blessing. For the one who desires life, to love and see good days, must keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. He must turn away from evil and do good. He must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and his ears attend to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against evildoers. So again, Peter repeating himself, as Paul often did. We are not called to give evil for evil or insult for evil, insult for insult. He just talked about that with Jesus. But instead, we're called to be a blessing to people who insult us. And it's for that reason that we were blessed.
Yeah, so I'll say this to you, and obviously the folks listening or watching. So remember in chapter 2 when we were talking about, so often today we as Christians, we want to fight fire with fire,
right.
And I was saying, yeah, that's like he says in whatever, and I couldn't find it. This is what I was looking for.
Yeah.
I knew I wrote it down. I knew I underlined it, and I couldn't find it, and then because we hadn't talked about it yet. So yeah, do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. You don't win any arguments that way.
That's right.
And as I say that, I also say that nobody's ever been argued to Christ.
Not really, no.
Nobody has ever won a debate and lost a debate and says, all right, I guess I'll give my life to Christ. You're right. It doesn't work that way.
Right.
You win them to Christ with love and with blessing and with showing compassion and doing things for them, showing love. I mean, in all the different ways of love. And you can't do that. People aren't going to listen. People aren't going to go along with you. When you trade insult for insult or evil for evil, they're just going to step it up and raise the bar and,
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
They're just going to keep coming back.
Yeah.
We're going to kind of up the ante, so to speak. And then he quotes Psalm 34, 12 through 16, and he shows that blessings come to those who turn away from evil, but God cannot continue to look upon those who do evil. So, all right, so we're going to jump down to verse 13 through 17. And then, I'm going to go through 17, and then we'll do 18 through 22 as well.
Did you read verse 13 already?
No.
Are we skipping that?
I did 12. So we're going to do 13.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I was
Did I
gonna
say
say
14?
You said 17.
Okay, yeah, 13 to 17.
Okay.
Okay.
Now we're on the same page.
Now we're on the same page. And so are you at home. All right. Verse 13. And who is there to harm you if you prove zealous for what is good? And even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed. And do not fear their intimidation, and do not be in dread, but sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, but with gentleness and respect. And keep a good conscience, so that in the things in which you are slandered, those who disparage your good behavior in Christ will be put to shame. For it is better, if God should will it so, that you suffer for doing what is right, rather than for doing what is wrong. All right, so we're going to break this down real quick, and then we'll go into verse 18. So we shouldn't be concerned about being persecuted for being zealous for good, right? So again, these are things that he's already kind of talked about. And he gets down there again, like we should definitely, in our zeal though, he talks about making giving an account for the hope that is in you. He says to do it with gentleness and respect. Mm-hmm. That kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier, people just don't want to hear it because the gospel is offensive. It's like that wasn't the gospel. You were the offender in that because of how you said that, what you did, and how you treated those people.
Sure.
The gospel is offensive because it reveals our sin, but sometimes we overstep and think that it gives us the right to be offensive and to be harsh.
Right.
When we should let the truth be what is harsh, and approach it with gentleness.
Yeah, one of the things that I kind of look at this is, especially in verse 13 and 14, we can't be sinless in God's eyes. God is never, he's not going to find us perfect. He sees the inside, and obviously he knows all and sees all. And so we obviously cannot be sinless. And while we can't be sinless to other people, we can live better lives in their view. I think people look at the lives of people differently than God does, because God sees us. God sees our sin, but he also forgives us of our sin because when we confess it because Jesus has already paid the price for it. When people see us, they people see like their good works for their good works. That guy's a good person because he does this and he does this and he does this and he does this, and they may think higher of him, which isn't necessarily how God sees us. But so he's saying be eager to do good. He's saying people are going to have a hard time coming up with something to say bad about you if you don't give them any ammo to say something bad about you about.
Absolutely.
And
then once they do say something bad, and once they disparage you, they will eventually be put to shame for it.
Yeah.
On one hand, I find that comforting to know that those who attack me are going to be, judged for that.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I find that challenging because oftentimes those people who are disparaging us are people that were once close to us, who couldn't accept what we lived and what we told them. And that's troubling.
Yeah.
But Peter kind of already talked about this before. The way that we approach that with them, while they may disparage us today, tomorrow they may come to glorify God because they may come to their senses on what they're doing.
Well, and this, so many times, and this kind of is outside of what we read in the Bible, not antithetical to it, but you don't really hear about this in the Bible. But you often hear people about, people put down other people because of them, not you. If somebody if somebody has a problem, if somebody says something bad, they're disrespecting you. There's probably something going on inside of them that's causing them to do that. It probably doesn't have anything to do with you, and so that is because we're all sinned. We're all sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and so it's important for us to remember that. Yes, you are going to be persecuted, even though you don't deserve it. But the people that are doing that, they're sinners too, and so. We don't get the opportunity to, judge them. Obviously, we know God does that. God sees that, and God will judge them at the end. Our job is to love and to be slow to anger and to be patient and share the gospel with whoever. It doesn't matter whether they speak kindly or ill of us.
Exactly. We've talked a lot too about hypocrisy, and we've talked a little bit about, being set apart and living different and living this. But like at the same time, we've acknowledged that we all fail and fall short of that, right? And I think something that sometimes gets missed is how we handle our shortcomings is also a witness. When we do what is wrong, when we mess up, the way we approach that, the way we repent, and the way we confess our sins is a witness and a testimony that we are trying to live in God's kingdom.
Yeah, it's not necessarily natural to turn the other cheek,
right?
And I was kind of talking about this. I think in episode when we're talking about in chapter 2, in a different realm. I was talking before, like when everybody goes one way or does something or says something, and you go different. people will see that, and
Yeah.
they might make fun of you at first, but some people will see that and respect that. In the same way, like we're talking about here, if somebody does you wrong, if somebody does you harm, somebody says something about you, but you don't repay evil for evil or insult for insult, people will notice that too.
Yeah.
And if you do that enough, they will notice.
Yeah.
And I think that's what Peter says here when he's talking about always prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. If you're very patient, if you let insults and things like that, bounce off you like water off a duck's back, like they say, that's going to be different. And so if you do that enough, somebody will ask. It's like, how are you able to yada, yada, yada? It may not be the person that is hurling those insults at you, but other people. And that's when you give that testimony. That's when you give that account. Be ready to give that account. Here is how I am here's where my patience comes from.
Why?
It is not through me. It is through Jesus Christ.
Why do you refuse to defend yourself?
Yeah.
Because I don't have to.
I don't have to. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So verse 18. For Christ also suffered for sins once for all time, the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God, having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which he also went and made proclamation to the spirits in prison, who once were disobedient when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah, during the construction of the ark, in which a few, that is, 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Corresponding to that, baptism now saves you, not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who is at the right hand of God, having gone into heaven after angels and authorities and powers had been subjected to him. All right, so this one starts out where we talk about how Jesus, he suffered once and for all. He was the just. We were the unjust. There's no additional payment necessary there. He's paid our price, right? He died in the flesh, but he was resurrected by the Spirit. Again, we're seeing the differences in natures and how we die to the flesh and resurrect in the Spirit. So here's where things get a little interesting and a little different. And these are the types of verses that sometimes get overlooked because they're hard to find practical application for.
Yeah.
But this is really interesting. He talks about Jesus preaching to the spirits who were in prison. He went and made proclamation to the spirits in prison who were disobedient when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah during the construction of the ark. So the earliest beliefs around this, so like basically understanding that I have of this is that these spirits were demonic spiritual beings from the time of Noah, right? So at that time, basically everybody on earth was evil and influenced by the demonic, right? Yeah. And so then the flood comes and kind of washes everything away. And these spirits are now in, and these who died in that are now in this kind of almost purgatorial type prison.
Yeah.
Right. Which is, again, it's this interesting spiritual concept. But Jesus was not preaching the gospel to them, but he was declaring victory over evil to them, is the way this has been interpreted and the way that most would look at this, which ultimately is bad news for those evil spirits and those things that are, that basically missed the boat quite really, and then he goes on here, and so before I move on from that's the basics here. I think there's a lot to unpack about the spiritual beings that are talked about in the Bible, but I don't know that we can cover that here.
Yeah, that's probably a whole other episode.
Maybe multiple. Yeah. So then we see then Jesus then. Peter compares the baptism in Jesus to the flood of Noah, but not to say that baptism is required. Mm-hmm. But he's basically kind of likening, like you see the symbolism here.
Yeah.
That just as the world was made right with water, you have been made right with the blood of Christ. So then. And then he informs us that Jesus has moved basically to heaven, where he sits at the right hand of God, and all angels and authorities and powers have been subjected to him. So the end of that chapter is Peter painting this picture of a victorious Christ in heaven, seated on the throne, which is a great thought.
Yeah, he kind of there's not a kind of an not necessarily an unintentional, but a sideways kind of compare and contrast. You know, the water in Noah's time was death, and it represented destruction, and they were saved from the water.
Yeah.
Whereas in baptism, the water represents your salvation and that you are saved through the water. And that can get into a whole other episode of, well, you don't have to be baptized. That's a whole other thing.
But it is similar. It is similar in the sense that, like, you know, baptism is about it's you're recreating the act of dying, being buried, and then coming back, essentially, as this new creation. And that's what God did with the flood, is he basically washed away all of the old and said, we're starting the new.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, no, that's a great way of putting it. And it's, you know, he goes a step further. Like, this isn't washing away dirt. This is washing away everything that covers you, all the sins, all of the everything that washes away the old self, the old self dying and being risen and made new.
Right, which is really, really highlights again that this is a spiritual allegory, that the physical baptism is not what's important.
Yeah.
You know, it's the baptism of the heart, so to speak. Because I know some people have gotten into this trap. We had Ethan, our friend Ethan, on the podcast not too long ago. Brandon and I talked to him, and he grew up in this church that preached you had to be baptized to be saved. Yeah. That's the new circumcision.
Yeah.
You know,
absolutely.
Or at least in those circles that's the case. And what Peter's informing us here is the important thing is not the water. It's what happens in here.
Yeah.
You know, so all right. Any last thoughts about 1 Peter chapter 3?
Not that I can think of, no.
All right, man. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna call it, and we will come back with chapter 4. And there are 5 chapters in 1 Peter, so we'll have 5 total chapters that we'll cover here in 1 Peter, and then we will move on to 2 Peter after that, which should be fun as well. All right. Thank you all for listening.